I am going to start with the first question, if that's okay, as those questions begin. I'm really curious what your thoughts are as an ongoing leader, but with a history of having led the National Academy of Medicine, or at the time Institute of Medicine, about the role that the science establishment can play in influencing policy. And I'm curious in particular if you have any reflections about lessons for the future for the American science establishment in influencing policy. And also, given the international membership of the society, observations about how science has interacted with government in other nations and what lessons there might be for countries around the world from this.
Well, thank you for a really important question. The relation of science to policymakers is a matter literally of life and death in a case of COVID. And so it's a two-way street. A policymaker has to be prepared and able to take advantage of the best science. And scientists, for their part, have to be prepared to present the information in a way that is understandable and usable. I would stress two key features. The first is humility. The problem of overconfidence based on meager data has dogged the relations between science and policymakers in emerging infections, infectious disease, in health broadly, and frankly, in many other spheres as well. Being mindful of our own limitations, of what is known and knowable at a moment in time, and being able to take account of the appropriate spectrum of responsible and informed science. This is really a key starting point, a key feature. And the second point I would emphasize is communication and communication skills. Very importantly, particularly in dealing with a complex situation and conveying critical messages to a public and to a policy-making community, remember that what convinces you about evidence and your ability to cope with uncertainty and your ability to manage in a way that balances simultaneously many relevant considerations may not be attributes of the lay public. And we, are very fond of training ourselves to focus on the science, focus on the data, focus on the evidence. And we believe that the plural of anecdote is not evidence. At the same time, when communicating, conveying clearly the state of science, we have to be able to speak in terms that resonate and have real meaning to the listener without distortion. And that is a very difficult balancing act to convey. How to convey honestly and accurately in an undistorted way that is still understandable. So humility and communication, David, those are 2 points in the relationship from the scientific side that I would emphasize.
I think those are wonderful answers. And interestingly, the very top question in the chat right now resonates with this and gives me a chance to build on it. The question, which is from Heather Gold, is how do we best explain uncertainty in models to lay folks? How do we explain changing scientific evidence, that is science that isn't static, with such suspicion of science and ideas for how to engage and help lay people understand? How do we do that? And then I'll add to that, I think one of the challenges of this is that oftentimes you don't have the degree of confidence that people want. So what they want you to say isn't what you feel you can scientifically say. And so there's an added tension there.
That's so true. Both an excellent question from Heather and David. Your point at the conclusion are really challenging parts of this. One reason humility is so important is that it also conditions the degree to which you emphasize with what level of confidence the beliefs as they are available today and not beyond those beliefs. John Maynard Keynes, the economist, the famous economist, was accused by a critic of being inconsistent and now espousing recommendations and policies that contradicted his previous views. And his reply was, "When the facts change, I change my mind. What, sir, do you do?" And so scientists have to be prepared to say, yes, we learn as we go. It does mean that, again, being able to express that degree of uncertainty, to put it in terms that people understand. For example, many people have become familiar with predictions about the weather. And they understand that when they're told there's a 60% chance of rain, it doesn't mean it's going to rain that day. And so sometimes if you can connect your messaging of uncertainty to a more familiar arena in the mind of the individual, so they can frame it in that context, as long as it's not distorting of your message, that can be one trick in a way to try to convey that uncertainty in an understandable and useful way.
Great, great. So our current top question is from Anton Avanitz. Apologies for pronunciation. And the question is, how do we encourage more foundations like Moore to invest in modeling projects beyond COVID-19 models? How do we convince philanthropy of the value of simulations, cost effectiveness analyses, and so on? And what role can or should SMDM play in that?
It's a great question, and really important for the future of the work that many of us involved in SMDM care so much about. Modeling can be very abstract for people and hard to understand. One of the things that I am hopeful will emerge from the COVID experience will be a number of instances where one can point to the benefits of modeling to demonstrate new insights that actually had an important influence on policy. So just to cite one example, modeling analyses of diagnostic test strategies, which tend to emphasize the performance of the test not as an isolated single event, but as part of a strategy of repetition with the attributes of individual tests combined over a series of tests, and the insights that can be gained according to what timing of tests and what attributes of tests in terms of sensitivity, specificity, time to return of answers, etc. This exercise can be very valuable in informing and shaping institutional policies of how often and what kinds of tests do we employ. As one example, I hope that out of the COVID experience, one will be able to document a number of ways in which models provided added clarity, added insight, added confidence in the steps that were being taken and should be taken in coping with the pandemic. You know, when it comes to support from philanthropies like the Moore Foundation, so much depends really on the fundamental interests and foci chosen by the benefactors, the individuals who have underwritten the private philanthropy. But when it comes to government agencies, emphasis of the relevance and important, finding allies from adjacent or related fields, in our instance, such as engineering, can be a very important part of building the case for additional focal support on models and analytic strategies for coping with these complex situations. So it's not an easy task, but it can be done, and evidence built up from the experience can make a difference.
That's great. One of our questions in the question and answer session is about sort of the variability in practice patterns by hospitals and over time and outcomes. And I think this is a general concern, but is a concern particularly for modeling exercises, because the model obviously assumes a bunch of things about a given context, and there's so much variability in context. I'm curious if you could comment a little bit about that tension and about various strategies that you see as useful in the context of that.
You know, this is really a challenge to the art of model building around the science. And those are the choices of the degree of differential specificity you build into the model in order to more accurately portray the variability in the factors that you're trying to take account of. And from my vantage point, I have a very practical empirical guide to this. When your modeling exercise in hypothetical instance can demonstrate that that level of differential representation does not materially affect the results that you can obtain, then it's a good signal you ought to simplify, and you can make that generalization. But when that differential choice in different hospitals, for example, David, as you're describing, does have a material effect on the outcomes, then you have an obligation to do your best to try to incorporate and represent that added measure of variability and complexity. So it is really conditioned on the circumstances of the particular case and purpose that you're trying to serve with your model.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things I've noticed locally is that people working at our institution who I never particularly thought of as modelers, all of a sudden are modelers. And they're building their own models of how many ICU beds we're going to need and what admission rules we should do. And, you know, it's wonderful and exciting that they're doing this, but I can't help but imagine that this is happening all around the country and all around the world. And that if there were tools that brought these back into the hands of local modelers, and we thought a little more as a society about how to do that, it could really increase our impact potentially.
That's a really interesting observation, David. You know, on the one hand, you do want 1,000 flowers to bloom. You want people to use systematic, organized approaches in thinking through the choices and options that they are able to consider. But you raise a really interesting and I think potentially quite telling idea of whether, in a sense, some effort to codify, embrace, and prioritize among questions where modeling could be applied, if that could be more successful as a group exchange and a set of discussions among those with modeling expertise, as well as those with the problems that need to be modeled, could not give us a better sense of prioritization. You know, you want to be sure that as a modeling community, there's not a, let's say, bias toward the solvable as opposed to the important and pressing. And so that interaction might be a really interesting way to engender the next generation of challenging questions for modeling. And the other aspect of what you're describing is the fact that if many places are facing the same problem, the idea that they are independently crafting their own model and gathering their own data and not learning from one another sufficiently is another real handicap in being optimally informed and able to proceed in a way that takes advantage of best knowledge and practice. Really important point.
One additional question for me, and then I'll turn back to the others. We've seen an incredible change in the role of technology in our lives and how we communicate. You know, Zoom perhaps being one of the most striking, but against a backdrop of social media and all the other changes that have happened. I recently was looking at some of the highest cited articles in journals. And one of the amazing shocks to me is that almost all the highest cited journal articles ever are about COVID. And so we have had this absolutely, I know first an incredible increase in the number of submissions to journals and now this tremendous degree of attention. But, so much of this attention is in social media. And so I was wondering if, given your interest in policy and relevance to the population and the sort of spread of all of this and democratization of the movement of knowledge, if you have advice about how individual scientists, but also society should think about its presence in social media and the use of those sorts of mechanisms to move scientific information.
This is another, I think, big challenge for all of us who care about public understanding of science and a condition like COVID. COVID is, like the proverbial morning hanging. It concentrates the mind. What has happened and is so extraordinary is the number of people in any walk of life, not just virologists, scientists, clinicians, public health experts, but regardless of where you are, who now wake up thinking about, worrying about, concerned about, interested in COVID. And so that focus of broad attention is both a challenge and an opportunity. It's the challenge because it means that people are getting a lot of misinformation and all of the, if you will, perverse qualities of social media, amplification of falsehood, distraction into irrelevancies, ways in which people lose sight of what's important. All of these, again, when you have a condition that is a matter of life and death, just become ferociously worrying and frustrating. At the same time, this level of attention means that the scientific community, speaking responsibly, consistently, coherently, can really make a very important difference to the segment of the public and the policymakers who are prepared to hear and to absorb the fundamental scientific messages. So in addition, perhaps to the ideas about humility and communication that we talked about earlier, the idea of being consistent, flexible, taking advantage of the full array of vehicles to reach the public, which today fundamentally has to embrace the social media. These are important tools for those of us, again, who care about public understanding, need to take up and to master.
Great, thank you. We have about 5 minutes more left in the session, and there's one question here, and there may be a moment for one or two more depending on what comes in. So this question is from Laura Scher, reads, you mentioned reproducibility and replicability as two of the key features of science. What are your thoughts on how we as a society, oops, it's moving down on me, on how we as a society can work to improve reproducibility and replicability of our work and be scientific leaders in this respect? You mentioned data sharing, and I'm wondering if you have further thoughts.
Well, thank you very much, David. I would like to recommend a report from the National Academies. It's a committee that I chaired a couple of years ago. The report emerged last year, maybe it was even in the turn of the previous, but it's relatively recent, on reproducibility and replicability in science. This report goes through some detail about the challenges and opportunities for reproducibility and replicability. In terms of that work, the idea of reproducibility, as I've been describing, is working from the same data and methods to reproduce the results that previously were put forward by the original analyst. Replicability refers more to the idea of repeating an experiment, perhaps in a different population, to test whether the fundamental conclusions are replicated in a second study with a different set of data, different participants, and so on. Now, when it comes back to reproducibility for the society, a number of societies with publications have adopted policies about the open sharing of any of the data that underlies models or publication within the journals of the society. And this is one tool that is proving to be effective. There's a society in political science even that actually insists that before publication, and as you know, in political science, many complicated models are put forward of projection and so on, but it insists that the actual code be available and they redo the study with an independent body to ensure that the original results are reproducible. They could be wrong, of course, but they have to be reproducible by the model code and data of the original paper. Now that's a rather extreme but very telling case of the extent to which open science and reproducibility as well as replicability have become more and more salient to thinking about progress across science, and certainly when it comes to policy relevant fields in medical decision making and public health policy making.
Wonderful. And we have just 2 minutes, but there's one question that feels compelling, particularly in this time, to respond to. It's from Nagin Hajzdadeh, and it is, could you speak about how to incorporate the influence of racism, perhaps the more important term as opposed to race, on outcomes? And I guess the even more general statement is behaviors in models, and particularly behaviors that maybe that are certainly problematic.
Okay, so well, racism first for me is a multi-layered phenomena that expresses itself in the hearts and minds of individuals, also in institutional practices, in social mores, and in the lived experience of peoples in marginalized or disadvantaged or biased against groups. And so racism itself is a multi-layered phenomena that when we talk about it from an analytic point of view and we want to incorporate it, I think the first thing to be clear about is what dimension of racism are we really focused on? Is it what's going on in the minds of individuals, in the expressions of institutions? Is it the larger society? Is it the history of prejudice, discrimination, and inequity that is the focus? So that would be the first issue. The second question, racism, like any behavior, you pointed out, could you take account of other behaviors? If you model behavioral choice, racism as an influence on choice can be, in principle, modeled the same way degree of age or sex and gender, male, female, or degree of income, geographic location, any of the things that influence behavior can in effect be incorporated and modeled. What's special about racism in our context is it also can be thought of as a factor in terms of cause, but also an outcome that we care very much about, so that reducing racism, containing the effects of racism, counteracting the history of racism can be as much of an outcome as they are inputs and determinants from the point of view of modeling. So those are just a few thoughts about what would be a really challenging but important exercise in trying to model more accurately what does and will occur.
Dr. Feinberg, thank you so much for a wonderful session and for your ongoing leadership. We are so indebted to you in so many ways, and so grateful for all that you have done and continue to do. So thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be with you.